This is the story of the great tea break heist. Tea break heist, you inquire? What is this tea break of which you speak? Far have I travelled in our fair land, but never have I witnessed such a thing. Brethren, sisters, sons and daughters, I can only explain it in this way. I went to work in the year 1970, and there were tea breaks. I left work a good many years later, and by that time the concept had been largely buried in a shallow grave with a sharpened teaspoon through its heart. But the last few tea breaks lingered in some distant outposts like Japanese soldiers fighting on in the jungle, unaware that the war was over. And I believe I may have witnessed the death of one of the last of the species. Gather round, Generation Z and Millennials and Post-Millennials and whoever the hell came after that, for I am to discourse wonders. For on my first day at work in September 1970, an object of wonder rattled around the open plan office, and verily it bore upon it an urn of goodly proportions, whereof came steam and prodigious heat, and foregathered around the urn were cups and saucers of white china, and jugs flowing with milk and sugar, and packets of Huntley and Palmer's, and custard creams, and cakes of many kinds, and it was pushed by two ladies. And though this soundeth sexist, yet verily 'tis true. And great joy was in their coming hither, and reams of print-out paper were cast aside, and pens flew to the ground like chaff before the sickle, and none stayed at their desks, but they sought out corners, and great discourse was had, and joyous was the sound thereof. I bid you join me 25 years on. No longer working among the buzz of the money changers, I am now employed in a small town in the Midlands. My job involves telling tourists about the life of a famous writer. I like this job. We all like this job. We like this job a good deal. We like our line managers and the people we work with. We even like the tourists, even the Americans. In fact, especially the Americans, who are unfailingly polite and mostly pretty bright. The place is very crowded during the summer. Between signing in and lunch, there are some 3 to 4 hours when we are required to talk, almost without cease, welcoming tourists, giving the spiel, and answering their questions. So, when the volunteers came round to take over the room for 10 minutes or so, it's a great relief. Hot drink to soothe the throat, hot pee to soothe the bladder, hot gossip in the staff restroom, then back to the fray. Then came the new man. Well, it was a relief at first. Before the man was the woman, who was utterly terrifying. The woman had a big office in a part of the building that commanded a view of most of the site. She seemed to know when someone was missing, when someone was falling down on the job. Conversely, she knew when anyone had made a special effort when presented with some kind of crisis. She once praised me for spontaneously entertaining a crowd of French kids when the house was closed to visitors during a medical emergency. But even her praise, oh my beloved sons and daughters, was terrifying. She was that kind of woman. She knew her stuff and knew what was going on and took an interest. All these things are very disconcerting qualities in a manager. The new man made it clear from the start that he didn't care much what happened in the building or its environs. He rarely ventured from his office, and most didn't know him by sight. The new man decided that a tea break was an expensive luxury that the organisation could well do without. The new man clearly didn't save any money by this, because all tea breaks had been covered by unpaid volunteers. But it was a matter of principle. It was very important to him that the lives of his staff should be made that tiny bit nastier. And verily, he was the Lord of all he surveyed. And the Lord said, "Let there be no tea breaks." And behold, it wasn't so. He was an inventive and enterprising man, so this wasn't his only idea. I am certain that he had other ways of making life a little nastier for the staff, because he had a rare talent for it. But I jacked the job in soon after the man took over, and this, oh beloved ones, is the way I witnessed the final terrible death agonies of the tea break. But these were merely personal recollections of a change which took place in workplaces throughout the country over many decades. So let us return now to the 70s. Margaret Hilda Thatcher took over the leadership of the Conservative Party in 1975 and was elected in 1979 in the wake of the Winter of Discontent, in which Jim Callaghan was ousted after chaos had ensued when, ironically, he tried to take on the power of the unions. Margaret had many targets, and in retrospect, I suppose her main mission was a more weaponised version of Callaghan's struggle with the unions. He had tried to placate union bosses with beer and sandwiches. She found mounted policemen with sticks a more effective and direct method of getting her way. And as it happens, the year after her election, a strike took place which was entirely based on the tea break. According to the Mirror, the workers on the track at British Leyland were allowed 51 minutes for breathers during the day. I have never worked on a production track. I imagine it to be monotonous and physically demanding, but that level of tea break time sounds reasonably generous. And the strike seems to have been settled when the union agreed to trim a few minutes off the break time. So the long-term strike seems to have been pretty futile, or arguably the union won. It seems to have been the kind of dispute that could have been settled by arbitration in a couple of hours, maybe with the aid of beer and sandwiches, or perhaps beer and skunkweed might have been more effective. All this seems to reinforce the idea of work-shy, tea-addicted Brits, but it's more complicated than that. It always is. A 1980 survey, the year before the settlement of the BL dispute, tells a completely different story. At this time, British workers at Ford got a 10-minute break, while their Danish counterparts got 12 minutes. Spanish workers got 19 minutes, and at the epicentre of the economic miracle, the Germans got 28 minutes. Meanwhile, those in the Netherlands were on 40 minutes of paid breaks, but that's not all. Pay and conditions were also inferior for British workers, who earned a good deal less than Ford workers on the continent. For a basic 40-hour week, Ford employees in Britain got £373 per month, comparing very unfavourably with their European counterparts. Danes earned the equivalent of £540, Germans £500, Netherlands employees £460, French £386. British Ford workers also had lower holiday entitlements and sick pay. Or maybe the workers actually had a legitimate gripe. Were there union excesses? Well, let me dive quickly back into personal recollection. A car company wanted temporary workers for just one night. Around 1971 this was, I think. A friend told me, and we turned up at a bleak factory somewhere. How arduous would the job be? Well, the task turned out to be counting a large barrel of nuts and bolts or something. I don't remember. Let's say widgets. Everyone on that factory floor realised that the easiest way of doing this would be to weigh a sample widget, then weigh the barrel, and well, you get the idea. But they wanted us to count them manually. I have no real idea what was happening that night, but I'm guessing there was a union-agreed quota of people who had to be present, and we were there to fill the numbers. As far as I know, nothing purposeful happened whatsoever. But we did get paid. Meanwhile, the News of the World does a big expose on the Land Rover plant in Solihull in November 1979. It was established that workers in the paint priming shop were knocking off early and going to sleep. They were fulfilling their work quotas. Then they were hunkering down into sleeping bags for a kip. They had found that they were able to load the conveyor in such a way that it made the work speedier, so they simply slept out the rest of the shift once the quota was complete. It wasn't the only such case, and it's somewhat difficult to justify, except, well, the job was being done. They just found a way of doing it faster. Presumably, if they'd deliberately done it all at a pedestrian pace, then all would have been well, and the impeccably virtuous staff of the News of the World would have been fine about the whole thing. So, what they were actually guilty of was simply finding a quicker way of getting the job done. In an ideal world, I suppose someone would have made an employee suggestion and this more efficient working method might have been adopted. That someone who made the employee suggestion would have got a pat on the back and a free holiday, and from then on, everyone would have been expected to work twice as hard. So, who actually gains from more efficient work practices like this? The shareholders, I suppose. Though since there was public funding involved at the time, that included the taxpayer. So who loses? Every subsequent employee who finds him or herself working twice as hard for the same money. Well, the morality is kind of complicated here. When a company becomes more efficient, who benefits? Did weavers benefit from the introduction of automatic weaving? From their point of view, smashing machinery was no more than a logical decision. It wasn't necessarily the best decision for everyone, because ultimately, automatic weaving produced cheaper clothes, but why would weavers be expected to sacrifice their own livelihoods for the greater good? More recently, car manufacturers have used robots to assemble cars. Is the money made by increased efficiency shared with the people who work there? Far from it. Jobs are more hard to get, and pay has barely kept up with inflation. Starting salary in a car production job is 15k, rising to 25k with experience. That's certainly not enough money to buy a house and feed a family. So who trousers the money saved by using robots instead of people? Certainly not the employees. The main point here is that once the power of the unions was broken, it wasn't just the excesses perpetrated by the unions that ended. It was any power to improve the lot of their members. By the 90s, the workforce was pliant and biddable. Workers acquiesced in new working practices. Union membership plummeted by some 7 million between 1980 and 2000. And all sorts of things which had been seen as perfectly normal, including earnings-related benefits if you lost your job, other rights including a break from work every couple of hours and sick pay and a pension scheme, were no longer a done deal. Or, to put it another way, for many people, life got worse, and they carried on getting worse. I have a relative who installs Windows and troubleshoots problematic installations. He's good at what he does and has years of experience, but pretty much everyone working in that trade is classed as self-employed, which means no sick pay, no holiday pay, no job security, no occupational pension. And if the company employing you goes bump because of the incompetence of managers, then you join the queue of creditors to get your pay. This stuff matters. In the late 90s came 0 hours contracts. These meant that all kinds of rights that had been regarded as perfectly normal could be dispensed with. In theory, this is the kind of contract I was on when I worked in the tourist trade. The National Trust also uses this kind of contract, but the fact that they were charitable trusts enjoying valuable tax exemptions didn't stop them from sacking some of us every couple of years in order to avoid being obliged to confer employee benefits on us. And who came up with this idea? The concept of 0 hours contract was introduced by the Employment Rights Act 1996, a hilarious misnomer, if ever there was one, in the dying years of John Major's administration. But the Blair government, which follows, seems to have had no problems with the idea, though they modified it slightly in 1998. So the lazy idea of blaming it all on the Tories just won't work in this instance. I believe that the idea of Britain being the lazy man of Europe has still stuck somehow after all these years. So, finally, I thought I'd do some very deep research on the subject to get some kind of comparison with other countries. When I say deep research, of course, I mean a quick internet search and a couple of phone calls. So, here we go. Deep dive, starting with France. In French offices, it seems, the pause café is alive and well and stretching to 20 minutes in the morning. It involves talking about work, but it doesn't involve working. Well done, French people. Sensible and civilised. A bit of work-related blather while you relax with a brioche or a croissant dipped in coffee. Perfect. Allez la France! The country that voted itself the most arrogant country in the world proves that its arrogance is well justified. And now to more personal recollections. My brother Tony has lived and worked in 2 European countries. In Sweden, he reports, there was a defined 15-minute coffee break in the morning and afternoon. Not a social event, but an unofficial meeting to discuss business. Sounds quite civilised. Bra jobbet, Sverige. Well done, Sweden. Germany, he reports, is not as draconian as you might think. If anyone had a birthday, there would always be cake, often with a sparkling wine breakfast with added nibbles. However, says Tony, there truly is a work ethic. Work hard, play hard, as we might say, or as they put it much more colourfully, Dienst ist Dienst und Schnaps ist Schnaps. It has a noble ring to it, given that Dienst means service rather than just work. Later, Tony experienced actual full-on breaks which couldn't be interrupted by anyone. Door knocks and ringing phones were studiously ignored. Union officials actually checked if anyone was working during the break, as this was considered really bad. So, nice one, Germany. So much for the concept of Teutonic automatons slaving relentlessly away at the latest economic miracle. Gut gemacht, Deutschland! As for Portugal, they follow the same practices here in the UK. An employee has to have a break after 6 hours work, though this break doesn't have to be paid. But in Portugal, it's common for employees to receive a monthly lunch allowance or meal card. The allowance is paid as per the number of working days and ranges between €4.77 and €7.63 per day. It's not that generous, but it's a hell of a lot better than nothing. So well done, Portugal. Portugal, bem feito. All of which seems to demonstrate that far from being the lazy bums of Europe, we've had that most British of things, the tea break, snatched from under our British noses by people claiming to be British patriots. The tea break in Britain is clearly dead now, the stuff of half-beliefs, myths and legends. In fact, far from taking mid-morning breaks from work, it's normal, perhaps even expected, in many offices, to have lunch al desco, holding a sandwich in one hand while punching computer keys with the other. Only a wimp would expect to take time away for something as trivial as enjoying a meal. And honestly, isn't it kind of important that people sometimes get a chance to enjoy life? Is it really all about maximising profit and squeezing the last ounce of value out of your staff? Really? What is this life if full of care? We have no time for a jammy dodger.
Oh, the factories may be roaring with the boom-a-lacka, zoom-a-lacka-wee, but there isn't any wrong when the clock strikes 4. Everything stops for tea.